Ethan Carter had never expected to inherit anything, let alone a failing diner on the edge of space. It had belonged to his alien stepdaughter, Zira, before she passed away unexpectedly. He hadn't seen her in years, and the guilt of their estrangement weighed on him as he stepped inside the dusty, dimly lit establishment. The neon sign flickered weakly, and the kitchen smelled of burnt oil and forgotten dreams. He had spent most of his life as a cargo hauler, dodging asteroid fields and running supplies for corporate overlords, not frying food for ungrateful customers. Selling the place seemed like the logical choice until his first customer arrived. The bell above the door gave a weak chime as the figure stepped inside, moving with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who had traveled far. The alien was tall, draped in a dark, weathered cloak that obscured most of his features, but Ethan caught the glint of metallic implants beneath the hood. The stranger slid into the booth by the window, fingers tapping rhythmically on the table, as if calculating something in his mind. Ethan hesitated before approaching. "Welcome to Zira's Diner. What can I get you?" he asked, his voice carrying more weariness than enthusiasm. The hooded figure spoke in a low, rasping tone. "Something simple. A human meal." His voice carried an eerie calm, as if the words themselves were carefully chosen. "Surprise me." Ethan frowned but nodded, retreating to the kitchen. He wasn't much of a cook, but he had picked up a few tricks during his years in deep space. He settled on a basic dish: grilled meat, a side of starch, and some sauteed greens. As he worked, he stole glances at his mysterious patron. There was something familiar about the way the alien carried himself, something that made the air feel heavier in the diner. He slid the plate in front of the stranger, half expecting him to scoff at the simplicity of the meal. Instead, the alien took a careful bite, chewing slowly, as if savoring each flavor like it held the answers to the universe. After a long silence, he reached into his cloak and pulled out a small, glowing data crystal, placing it on the table. "This is for you," he said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I don't take weird currency, pal." The alien's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It's not currency. It's knowledge." The cryptic response sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He hesitated before picking up the crystal. The moment his fingers brushed against it, a sharp, static-like sensation shot through his body, and for a brief second, images flickered in his mind: schematics, blueprints, calculations that made no sense to him. He stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair. What the hell was that? The alien leaned forward, his glowing cybernetic eyes finally visible beneath the hood. "The beginning of something much bigger than you, Mr. Carter." Ethan had seen enough strange things in his lifetime to know when trouble was knocking on his door. He had no interest in mysterious blueprints or cryptic messages, but something about this felt different. The weight of his stepdaughter's absence still lingered in the air, and a part of him wondered if she would have accepted this strange fate without hesitation. Sighing, he pocketed the crystal. "All right, I'll bite. What exactly am I looking at?" The stranger's fingers drummed against the table. "The last piece of a puzzle the galaxy has been trying to solve for centuries. A propulsion system unlike anything currently known. Faster than light, without the need for hyperspace lanes. The kind of technology that could change the balance of power forever." Ethan exhaled sharply. He had heard stories of engineers disappearing after working on breakthrough technology. Corporations and warlords alike would kill for something like this. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you are human," the alien said simply. "And because humanity has a habit of defying expectations." Before Ethan could process that, the front door burst open. 3 heavily armed figures stormed in, their weapons raised, their armor gleaming with corporate insignias. The leader, a bulky reptilian mercenary, fixed his cold gaze on Ethan. "Hand over the crystal," he growled. Ethan's heart pounded. He barely had time to process the situation before the hooded stranger moved. In a blur, he was on his feet, throwing a small device onto the floor. A pulse of energy rippled outward, short-circuiting the mercenary's weapons. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything was chaos. Ethan didn't think he just acted. Years of survival instinct kicked in as he grabbed the nearest metal tray and swung it at the nearest attacker. The mercenary stumbled, and before he could recover, the stranger delivered a precise strike that sent him crashing to the ground. Ethan didn't stop to celebrate. He grabbed the stranger by the arm and bolted toward the back exit. They barely made it outside before an explosion rocked the diner. Flames and debris shot into the air, and Ethan barely managed to shield himself as a wave of heat washed over him. He turned back to see his stepdaughter's diner, his last connection to her reduced to burning wreckage. His fists clenched. "You better start explaining real fast," he snapped. The stranger adjusted his cloak. "The moment I walked into your diner, you became part of something bigger. That crystal holds the key to revolutionizing space travel. And now that they know you have it, they won't stop coming." Ethan ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. He had spent years trying to live a quiet life, but trouble had a way of finding him no matter where he went. He glanced down at the crystal, still glowing faintly in his palm. He could run, leave all of this behind, but deep down, he knew that wasn't an option anymore. He looked at the stranger, jaw set. "All right. You got me into this mess. Now tell me how we get out of it." The stranger nodded approvingly. "First, we find a ship. Then, we change the course of history." As the smoke from the ruined diner curled into the night sky, Ethan realized one thing: he wasn't just some washed-up cargo hauler anymore. He was holding a secret that could shake the foundations of the galaxy. And for the first time in a long time, he felt alive. Jake Holden never expected to run a diner, especially not one floating in the middle of nowhere. He had spent most of his life flying cargo ships, smuggling goods through asteroid belts, and outrunning bounty hunters who had grudges bigger than their brains. But when his alien stepdaughter passed away unexpectedly, she left him the one thing she had truly cared about: her tiny, run-down diner on the edge of a forgotten trade route. Jake wasn't a chef, and he definitely wasn't interested in running a business, but something about the diner kept him from selling it. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was just the fact that he had nowhere else to go. The place was nearly empty most nights, just a few drifters stopping by for a quick meal before vanishing back into the void. The neon lights buzzed overhead, flickering in and out like they were on their last breath. He spent most of his time scrubbing the counters and fixing the ancient kitchen appliances, wondering how his stepdaughter had managed to keep the place running. Then, one night, everything changed. The door creaked open, and a lone figure stepped inside. He was an alien, tall and thin, draped in a heavy cloak that barely concealed the metallic implants running along his arms. His face was partially hidden by a hood, but Jake could see the sharp glow of cybernetic eyes scanning the room. He walked slowly, deliberately, like someone who had spent years running but finally had nowhere left to go. Without a word, he slid into the booth by the window. Jake wiped his hands on his apron and walked over. "Welcome to Zira's Diner. What can I get you?" The alien hesitated for a moment before speaking. His voice was low and deliberate. "A cheeseburger?" Jake blinked. "You want a cheeseburger?" He wasn't sure if he'd even seen an alien order human food before. Most stuck to their own species dishes, some of which Jake still wasn't sure were edible. The stranger nodded. "A real one. The way humans make it." Jake shrugged. "All right, coming right up." He walked back to the kitchen, shaking his head. Of all the things he expected that night, taking a burger order from a mysterious cloaked alien wasn't one of them. He pulled out the last of his good ingredients and started cooking. The scent of sizzling meat filled the air, mixing with the faint aroma of engine oil and old coffee. When the burger was finally done, he placed it on a plate, added a side of crispy fried tumors, and set it in front of the stranger. The alien picked up the burger carefully, studying it as if it were some ancient artifact. Then, he took a slow bite. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence and the sound of the diner's old ventilation system humming overhead. Then, something changed. The alien's cybernetic eyes flickered, glowing brighter. His fingers twitched, and for the first time since walking in, he looked genuinely surprised. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Good." The alien set the burger down and exhaled. "Better than I imagined." He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small metallic device, setting it on the table. "This is for you." Jake frowned. "I don't take weird tech as payment." The alien shook his head. This isn't payment. It's an offer. Jake leaned against the counter, arms crossed. All right. You've got my attention. The alien tapped the device, and a holographic projection flickered to life above it. Blueprints, formulas, and equations Jake couldn't begin to understand floated in the air. What you have just served me is more than food. It is a trigger. Jake frowned. A trigger for what? For thought, the alien said. Human food specifically, the way it is prepared stimulates certain neurological responses in species with cybernetic enhancements. For years, I have been working on a solution to a great scientific problem, but I could never find the missing piece. Until now. Jake stared at him. You're telling me a cheeseburger helped you solve some kind of galactic equation? The alien nodded. Yes. And if others knew, they would kill to control it. Jake exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had seen a lot of strange things in his lifetime, but this was a whole new level of crazy. All right, let's say I believe you. What exactly do you want from me? The alien leaned forward. I need you to cook. Jake almost laughed. Buddy, I barely know how to run this place, let alone cook something that messes with alien brains. You underestimate yourself, the alien said. But more importantly, you underestimate what your species is capable of. Before Jake could respond, the diner's front door burst open. 5 figures in sleek, corporate-grade armor stormed inside, their weapons raised. The leader, a broad-shouldered enforcer with a scar running down his cheek, scanned the room before his gaze landed on the alien. Dr. Trezix, he said, his voice cold. You've been causing problems. Jake tensed. He didn't need to be a genius to realize that these guys weren't here for dinner. Trezix remained calm, but Jake could see the subtle shift in his posture, the slight tension in his fingers, the way his cybernetic eyes flickered, scanning every possible exit. The enforcer turned his attention to Jake. You don't know what you're dealing with, human. Hand over the doctor, and we'll forget you were ever involved. Jake glanced at Trezix. The alien didn't say a word, but there was something in his eyes, an unspoken plea, a silent warning. Jake had spent most of his life running from other people's problems, avoiding trouble whenever he could. But something about this didn't sit right. He looked back at the enforcer and forced a smirk. Yeah, see, I don't take orders from guys who break into my diner with guns. The enforcer narrowed his eyes. You're making a mistake. Wouldn't be my first, Jake muttered. Then, without warning, he grabbed the nearest metal tray and flung it at the closest mercenary's head. It hit with a loud clang, sending the guy staggering backward. Before the others could react, Trezix moved faster than Jake thought possible. The alien activated a small pulse emitter, sending a shockwave through the room. The lights flickered, and the mercenary's weapons shorted out. Jake didn't wait for an invitation. He grabbed Trezix by the arm and bolted for the back exit. They barely made it outside before gunfire erupted behind them, bullets ricocheting off the metal walls. Trezix hit a button on his wrist, and a sleek black hovercraft decloaked just a few feet away. Jake hesitated. He could still turn back, pretend this wasn't his fight. But deep down, he knew he had already crossed the line. He climbed into the hovercraft beside Trezix. All right, Doc. You got me into this mess. What's next? Trezix gave a small, knowing smile. Now? We change the galaxy. One meal at a time. As the hovercraft shot into the dark void of space, Jake realized he had just traded in his quiet life for something far bigger than he ever imagined. And for the first time in years, he didn't mind one bit. The diner stood alone at the edge of known space, its neon sign flickering weakly against the endless void. It was the last stop before the great unknown, a place where drifters, smugglers, and wanderers came for one final meal before vanishing beyond the reach of civilization. Jack Morrison never intended to run the place. He had inherited it from his stepdaughter, Zyra, an alien who had built the diner with her own hands. She had believed in a simple philosophy that no matter how far someone traveled, they always needed a place to rest, eat, and remember they were still alive. But now, she was gone, and Jack was left with a half-functioning kitchen, a rusting coffee machine, and a growing sense of loneliness. Most nights, the place was quiet. A few customers drifted in, ate in silence, and left without saying much. Jack didn't ask questions, and they didn't offer answers. It was an unspoken rule in a place like this. But on this particular night, something felt different. The air was heavier, charged with something he couldn't quite explain. And then the bell above the door rang. A figure stepped inside, moving with careful precision. He was tall, wrapped in a heavy cloak that shimmered in the dim light. Jack caught a glimpse of his face, a mix of flesh and metal, cybernetic implants running down his jawline and disappearing beneath his collar. His eyes, glowing a faint blue, scanned the room before settling on Jack. Without a word, he walked to the counter and sat down. Jack wiped his hands on a towel and leaned forward. "What can I get you?" The stranger's voice was smooth, but there was something calculated about it. Something simple. A human dish. Jack nodded, turning toward the kitchen. He wasn't much of a chef, but he had learned enough to keep the place running. He pulled out the last of his fresh supplies and started cooking. The smell of sizzling meat filled the air, mixing with the faint aroma of old coffee and engine grease. He worked quickly, plating the meal and sliding it across the counter. "Here you go. House special." The stranger studied the food for a moment before taking a slow bite. Jack watched him carefully, trying to read his expression. After a long pause, the man nodded. "This is perfect." Jack exhaled, leaning back against the counter. "Glad you think so." The stranger set his fork down and reached into his cloak. Jack tensed, his fingers brushing against the blaster hidden under the counter. But instead of a weapon, the man pulled out a small metallic cube and placed it on the counter. It pulsed faintly, its surface shifting as if alive. Jack frowned. "What is that?" The stranger's glowing eyes locked onto his. "A key." Jack hesitated. "A key to what?" "To something that was never meant to be found." The words sent a chill down Jack's spine. He had seen plenty of strange things in his life, but this was different. He didn't know why, but something about this moment felt like the start of something much bigger than himself. Before he could ask more, the diner's door slammed open. A group of heavily armed figures stormed inside, their armor gleaming under the neon lights. Their leader, a scarred man with cold, calculating eyes, stepped forward. "Hand over the device," he ordered, his voice like steel. Jack glanced at the stranger. The man remained calm, but there was a tension in his posture. He didn't move. The scarred man stepped closer, placing a gloved hand on the counter. "I won't ask again." Jack's fingers tightened around the handle of his hidden blaster. He had spent years avoiding trouble, keeping his head down and staying out of fights that weren't his. But this was his diner, and he wasn't about to let some armored thug decide what happened in it. He let out a slow breath. "You boys sure you want to start a firefight in the only diner before the void?" The scarred man narrowed his eyes. "You don't understand what's at stake." Jack smirked. "Yeah, I get that a lot." Without warning, he grabbed the nearest metal tray and hurled it at one of the gunmen. The distraction was enough. The stranger moved fast, too fast. In the blink of an eye, he activated the cube, and a pulse of energy rippled through the room, short-circuiting the mercenaries' weapons. The lights flickered, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, chaos erupted. Jack dove over the counter as gunfire tore through the air. The stranger moved like a ghost, weaving between the attackers with deadly precision. One by one, they fell, their weapons useless, their armor failing under the weight of his attacks. Jack didn't wait for an invitation. He grabbed the cube off the counter and ran for the back exit. The stranger was right behind him. They burst into the alley, the cold air biting against Jack's skin. A sleek, black ship was waiting at the end of the dock, its engines humming. Jack turned to the stranger, breathless. "You got a plan, or are we just winging it?" The man gave a rare smirk. "A bit of both." They sprinted toward the ship as more mercenaries spilled into the alley. Jack dove into the cockpit, flipping switches as the engines roared to life. The stranger took the co-pilot seat, tapping rapidly on a console. Jack grabbed the controls. "Hold on." The ship lurched upward, breaking free of the docking clamps just as bullets sparked against the hull. Jack twisted the controls, sending them into a sharp ascent. Within seconds, they were soaring into the void, the stars stretching around them. He exhaled, glancing at the stranger. "All right, you want to tell me what the hell that cube is?" The man studied him for a moment before answering. "It's a map to something the universe forgot." Jack raised an eyebrow. "And now we have it?" The stranger nodded. "Yes. And now everyone will be coming for us." Jack stared out at the endless expanse ahead of them. He had spent years trying to escape the past, to live a quiet life in a forgotten diner. But now, he was at the center of something far bigger than he ever imagined. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to run. Jack Holden never expected to become a chef, let alone in a place like this. The diner he had inherited from his alien stepdaughter sat on the edge of a forgotten star system, a lonely beacon of neon light flickering against the vast darkness of space. It wasn't much, just a few booths, an old kitchen, and a menu that barely held together, but it was his. Most nights, business was slow, just a few weary travelers stopping by for a meal before they drifted back into the void. He didn't mind. It gave him time to think, to wonder why he was still here, running a diner in the middle of nowhere when he had spent most of his life flying between the stars. Then, one night, everything changed. The bell above the door chimed, and Jack looked up from the counter. A figure stepped inside, moving with an eerie sort of grace. They were tall and cloaked in dark fabric, but the hood slipped just enough for Jack to see their face smooth, angular, with strange glowing tattoos that shimmered like constellations. Their eyes weren't just looking around, they were calculating, as if measuring the diner itself. Jack felt an odd tension in the air, like the universe had just tilted slightly off balance. The stranger walked up to the counter and sat down without a word. Jack wiped his hands on a rag and leaned forward. "Welcome to Zira's Diner. What can I get you?" The stranger tilted their head slightly, as if considering the question too carefully. Then, in a voice that hummed with an unnatural resonance, they spoke. "Something with spices." Jack frowned. "Any preference?" The stranger's glowing eyes locked onto his. "Something that bends time." Jack let out a small chuckle, thinking it was a joke. But the stranger didn't laugh. Their gaze remained steady, unblinking. Jack's smile faded. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see what I can do." He turned to the kitchen, trying to shake the feeling creeping up his spine. It wasn't the first time he had met odd customers. This place was a magnet for wanderers and outcasts. But something about this one felt different. Still, a customer was a customer. He grabbed some of the last fresh ingredients he had, spices from different corners of the galaxy, and started cooking. The scent filled the air, rich, warm, something that made the diner feel less like an empty corner of space and more like home. He worked carefully, adding a pinch of this, a dash of that, guided more by instinct than by any real recipe. It was the way Zira had taught him. Cooking, she used to say, isn't about feeding the stomach. It's about reaching something deeper. When the dish was done, Jack placed the plate in front of the stranger. "There you go," he said, wiping his hands. "House special." The stranger studied the meal for a long moment, then picked up the fork. They took a bite. The reaction was immediate. The air around them shimmered, like heat rising off metal. The neon lights flickered. Jack felt something twist in his stomach, a strange pulling sensation, as if the diner itself had just been yanked slightly out of place. The stranger exhaled slowly, setting the fork down. "Fascinating," they murmured. Jack stepped back. "All right," he said cautiously. "Mind telling me what the hell just happened?" The stranger glanced up, those glowing eyes brighter than before. "This dish," they said, "contains something unique. A combination of elements that resonate with the fabric of space-time itself." Jack blinked. "You're saying my cooking just messed with time?" The stranger nodded. "It's not just about taste. Certain ingredients, when combined in the right way, can influence the very structure of reality. I have spent years searching for such a catalyst. And you," they gestured at the plate, "have created it by accident." Jack ran a hand through his hair. He had been expecting another quiet night, not a physics lesson from an alien mystic. "Okay," he said, Let's say I believe you. What does this mean? The stranger tapped their fingers against the counter. It means others will come for it. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. Others? Before the stranger could answer, the door burst open. 3 figures stormed in, clad in sleek black armor, their faces hidden behind reflective helmets. Their weapons, humming with energy, were already raised. The leader took a step forward. "Hand it over," they demanded. Jack sighed. "Yeah, see, I really hate when people come into my diner making demands." The stranger rose from their seat, eyes glowing fiercely. "They are chrono hunters," they said. "They seek to control time itself. And now they know you hold a key to it." Jack glanced at the sizzling pan still on the stove. He hadn't asked for this. He was just a guy trying to keep a rundown diner alive. But if there was one thing he knew, it was this: no one walked into his place and started making rules. He grabbed the nearest hot pan and hurled it at the lead hunter. The searing oil splashed across the figure's armor, sending them staggering backward. The second hunter raised their weapon, but the stranger was faster, raising a hand and twisting the air itself. Time rippled. Jack saw the bullet fired, but it moved as if trapped in molasses, hanging in the air before reversing back into the barrel of the gun. Jack ducked behind the counter, grabbing the only thing he had: a handful of the same spices he had used in the dish. Without thinking, he flung them into the air. The moment the powder touched the shimmering distortion, the entire room shifted. The neon lights flickered violently. The floor beneath them twisted like liquid. The hunters screamed as their bodies warped, bending in and out of reality before vanishing entirely. Then silence. Jack slowly stood up, his heart pounding. The stranger remained perfectly calm, adjusting their cloak. "Impressive," they said. "You have a natural talent." Jack exhaled, running a hand down his face. "I just threw some damn seasoning." The stranger smirked. "And in doing so, you altered space-time itself." Jack looked at the empty space where the hunters had stood. His diner, the last place before the edge of space, had just become ground zero for something far bigger than he ever imagined. He turned to the stranger. "All right," he muttered. "You better start talking. Because if people are coming after my cooking, I need to know what I'm up against." The stranger nodded. "Then we have much to discuss." As the two of them sat down, Jack realized his quiet life was officially over. The universe had just changed, and somehow it all started with a plate of food. And for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Jack Holden had never planned to run a diner, let alone one that sat on the edge of a lawless sector of the galaxy. The Galactic refugee diner had been a gift, or maybe a curse, left to him by his stepdaughter, Zira, a wandering alien with a heart too big for the cruel universe. She had always believed in one thing: that everyone, no matter how lost or hunted, deserved a place to rest, eat, and remember they were alive. And so, she had built this little sanctuary in the middle of nowhere, far from the prying eyes of empires and warlords. But Zira was gone now, and Jack was left to keep the doors open, flipping burgers and pouring coffee for whoever drifted in from the void. Most nights were quiet. Travelers came and went, their eyes filled with ghosts of the past, their hands quick to reach for weapons, but never using them within the diner's walls. That was the unspoken rule: no violence here. The diner was neutral ground, a place where enemies could sit at different tables, pretending, just for a while, that the galaxy wasn't burning around them. But on this particular night, as the neon lights flickered against the blackness of space, Jack felt something shift. He had learned to trust his instincts. They had kept him alive through wars, smuggling runs, and back alley deals. And right now, those instincts were telling him that trouble was about to walk through his door. The bell chimed. A figure stepped inside, wrapped in a tattered cloak, their face hidden by the deep shadows of a hood. They moved carefully, as if expecting a trap, their steps measured, controlled. Jack didn't flinch, didn't reach for the blaster hidden beneath the counter. Instead, he wiped his hands on a towel and nodded toward the newcomer. "Welcome to the Galactic Refuge," he said. "Take a seat, stranger." The figure hesitated, then slowly moved to a booth in the far corner, away from the windows, away from the exit. Jack had seen it before, the way people sat when they didn't want to be seen, when they were running from something bigger than themselves. He grabbed a menu and walked over, setting it on the table. "What'll it be?" The stranger didn't look up. A gloved hand slid across the menu, tracing the words as if reading was unfamiliar. When they finally spoke, their voice was quiet, almost mechanical. "Something. Human." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Got a preference?" The stranger hesitated. "Something. Warm." Jack didn't ask questions. He had learned long ago that people came here to escape, not to explain. He turned back to the kitchen, pulling out what little fresh supplies he had left. The galaxy had long since turned to artificial food, nutrient blocks, and synthesized proteins, but Jack refused to serve that garbage. If someone walked into his diner, they deserved a real meal. He cooked the way Zira had taught him, slow, deliberate, letting the smells and flavors build, letting the warmth of real food remind people of what they had lost. The dish sizzled. Jack stole a glance at the stranger. They hadn't moved, hadn't relaxed. If anything, they were tenser than before, their fingers tapping rhythmically against the table, their eyes barely visible beneath the hood watching the door. He slid the plate in front of them. "How special," he said, leaning against the counter. The stranger reached out, pulling the plate closer. For a long moment, they simply stared at the steam rising from the meal. Then, slowly, they lifted a fork and took a bite. Jack saw it the way their shoulders loosened just slightly, the way the tension in their posture faded. Whatever they had been expecting, it wasn't this. "This," the stranger murmured. "This is real." Jack shrugged. "Yeah, well, I don't serve synth crap here." The stranger took another bite, slower this time, as if savoring something they hadn't tasted in a long time. Jack didn't press them for details. Some people just needed to eat without conversation. But then the door slammed open. Jack turned sharply. 5 figures stepped inside, their movements precise, their armor sleek and black. Mercenaries. No hunters. The lead one scanned the diner, their helmet reflecting the dim light. Their voice was cold, emotionless. "We're looking for a fugitive." Jack sighed, already regretting not locking the door. He glanced at the stranger, who had gone completely still, their fork hovering mid-air. The hunter stepped forward. A high-value target. Armed and dangerous. Their visor locked onto Jack. "Have you seen anyone unusual?" He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had a choice: hand over the stranger and let the hunters drag them away, or do what he had always done, protect the lost. He exhaled slowly. "This is a diner," he said. "Not an information booth." The lead hunter's helmet tilted slightly. "Interference will not be tolerated." Jack smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Yeah? Well, neither is bad manners." The hunter moved, reaching for their weapon. But Jack was faster. With a flick of his wrist, he grabbed the nearest metal pan and hurled it at the hunter's head. The impact sent them staggering back, their visor cracking from the force. Before the others could react, the stranger moved. One moment, they were sitting. The next, they were everywhere. Their cloak billowed as they leapt forward, moving like a phantom, striking with deadly precision. A blade appeared in their hands, small, curved, glowing faintly with energy. The nearest hunter fell before they could even raise their weapon. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed the blaster from beneath the counter and fired. The shot hit one of the mercenaries square in the chest, sending them crashing into a booth. The remaining 2 scrambled for cover, but it was too late. The stranger was already on them, moving with a speed that wasn't natural. In seconds, it was over. The diner was silent except for the hum of flickering lights. The hunters lay unconscious or dead, sprawled across the floor. The stranger stood among them, breathing heavily, their hood pushed back slightly, just enough for Jack to see something he hadn't expected. They weren't just running. They weren't just hiding. They were royalty. A faint, glowing mark pulsed on their forehead, a sigil that had been outlawed across half the galaxy. The mark of a fallen dynasty. Jack exhaled. "You really know how to pick a quiet hiding spot?" The stranger looked at him, eyes filled with something ancient. "You helped me." Jack shrugged. "It's what we do here." The stranger studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then I owe you a debt." Jack sighed, looking at the mess. "Yeah, well, you can start by helping me clean up." As they set to work, Jack realized one thing: he had just made an enemy of powerful people. But looking at the stranger, at the way they moved with purpose, he also knew something else. For the first time in a long time, the Galactic refugee diner had a real fight on its hands. And Jack wasn't about to back down.